In a climate-controlled vault beneath the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, there sits a clay prism approximately 8 inches tall. Its catalogue number is AN 1923-444. Scholars call it the Weld-Blundell prism. The clay is cool to the touch, the colour of desert sand dried beneath an ancient sun. 4 sides, 2 columns per side. Each surface covered in wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform script pressed into wet clay nearly 4,000 years ago. The text recorded on this prism makes a claim that should be impossible, not metaphorical, not symbolic. A direct procedural statement repeated across multiple independent sources. Kingship did not emerge from human innovation. It was lowered from heaven, and the beings who lowered it, whom the texts identify as Anunnaki, established a bloodline that ruled early civilization. Not approved kingship, not blessed kingship, not metaphorically divine kingship, a genealogical line recorded across generations, traced through named parents, specific cities, documented reigns. The Sumerian scribes who created these records were the world's first accountants, obsessive documentarians who inventoried grain stores, calculated field yields, and tracked trade shipments with numerical precision. These were not poets writing creation myths in symbolic language. They were record keepers, and their records claim something our current paradigm cannot comfortably accommodate. This is not a story about ancient astronaut theories or modern reinterpretations. This is an investigation into what the oldest written documents about kingship actually say, word by word, tablet by tablet. What did the Sumerians themselves believe about where their rulers came from? Before we begin, if you're listening to this as you settle in for sleep, take a moment to comment where in the world you're tuning in from. There's something profound about voices gathering from across the globe to examine humanity's oldest written records about its first kings. And if you're here for historical investigation that respects both evidence and mystery, you're in the right place. The prism beneath Oxford is not unique. Fragments of the same king list exist in university museums, private collections, archaeological storage rooms across 3 continents. The University of Pennsylvania holds tablets that expand on these genealogies. The British Museum preserves creation texts that describe how these bloodlines were established. The Louvre possesses relief carvings showing the goddess mother of kings receiving offerings in her temple. The question is not whether these documents exist. They do. The question is what they mean when they state, with administrative clarity, that certain rulers were born of divine parents, that specific kings claimed goddesses as mothers and appeared in temple reliefs alongside these figures. That annual rituals existed to maintain what texts describe as the sacred bloodline, that pre-flood rulers reigned for thousands of years, and post-flood dynasties showed progressively shorter, but still superhuman, lifespans, as if something was diluting across generations. The texts speak clearly. Our interpretations struggle. Let the evidence unfold. When gods walked among cities. To understand what the Sumerians recorded about bloodlines, you must first understand who the Sumerians were, not as figures in mythology, but as the architects of something unprecedented in human history, urban civilization built on written administration. Southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq. Approximately 4500 BC, farming communities began clustering into larger settlements. By 3500 BC, these settlements had grown into something the world had never seen. Cities, Uruk, Eridu, Ur-Nippur, Lagash, Kish, not villages, not tribal camps, cities with populations in the tens of thousands, monumental temple architecture reaching toward the sky, irrigation systems channeling river water across cultivated fields, and administrative centres managing resources for urban populations. This was not gradual. Archaeological evidence shows an explosion of complexity. Within a few centuries, the Sumerians went from village life to urban centres with specialised labour, long-distance trade networks, complex religious institutions, and the most consequential innovation of all, writing, cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. It emerged around 3200 BCE, initially as pictographic symbols for trade and inventory, but within centuries it evolved into a sophisticated writing system capable of recording not just quantities of barley and sheep, but language itself, laws, contracts, letters, prayers, historical records, and king lists. The mainstream academic narrative presents this as human invention, a progressive march from simplicity to complexity. Agricultural surplus enabled specialization. Population density required administration. Administration required record keeping. Record keeping enabled writing, a logical chain. But the Sumerian texts themselves never describe it this way. They never claim to have invented civilization. They describe inheriting it, receiving it, restoring it after a catastrophic interruption. The opening lines of their king lists don't begin with humans discovered agriculture or people built the first cities. They begin with a declaration. After kingship descended from heaven, consider the implications of that phrasing. Descended, not emerged, not developed, not invented. The verb choice is consistent across multiple versions of the text. Kingship existed elsewhere first, then it was lowered to earth. The Sumerian scribes are documenting a transfer of something that existed before them, not celebrating their own innovation. This extends to other cultural elements. Their myths describe divine beings teaching humanity the arts of civilization. Enki, the god of wisdom, is credited with bringing the Me, the divine decrees or cosmic principles that govern reality, to the city of Eridu. These Me included not just abstract concepts like justice or kingship, but practical technologies, metalworking, writing, construction techniques, agricultural methods, religious rituals, social organisation. The pattern is consistent. The Sumerians positioned themselves as recipients and preservers of knowledge that originated with divine beings they called Anunnaki. The word itself breaks down linguistically. Anu refers to An, the sky god, chief of the pantheon. Na means of or from. Ki means earth or land, those who from heaven to earth came. This is the literal meaning preserved in the Sumerian language, not a modern interpretation, but what the word components signify in their own tongue. These were not abstract cosmic forces. The texts describe the Anunnaki with specificity. They have names, genealogies, roles, responsibilities, temples, cities under their authority, and the Father God of Heaven, Enlil, Lord of the Storm, who commands the earth, Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom, Ninhursag, mother goddess who shapes life, Inanna, goddess of war and fertility, Utu, god of the sun and justice, Nanna, the moon god, each with defined functions, each with documented cult centres, each appearing in administrative texts receiving offerings, land grants and temple revenues. The Sumerian worldview did not separate myth from history the way modern minds do. To them, these were records. The gods were the elder generation. Humanity was younger. Cities were founded when divine beings chose to establish cult centres at specific locations. Kingship was the administrative system by which divine will was implemented on earth. And kingship did not pass to just anyone. It passed through bloodlines. This is where the conventional interpretation that these are merely mythological ways of expressing political legitimacy begins to encounter problems the texts themselves resist. The Sumerian king list is not a literary epic. It's a bureaucratic document. It lists cities in sequence, rulers in order, reign lengths in years. It has the tone of an administrative record, not poetry. In Eridu, Elulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Aljar ruled for 36,000 years. This continues through 8 pre-flood rulers. Then states the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over and kingship descended from heaven once more, Kish became the seat of kingship. The document then continues listing post-flood dynasties with the same administrative precision. Different cities, different rulers, progressively shorter reign lengths as the list reaches historical periods where archaeological and textual evidence can verify the names and approximate dates. The final rulers listed are known historical figures from the early 2nd millennium BC. Why would a scribe composing mythology suddenly shift into verifiable history? Why would a purely symbolic document preserve the actual sequence of historical dynasties? The simplest explanation is that the scribe believed the entire document was historical, that the pre-flood section recorded something the culture preserved as memory, and the post-flood section documented what came after. This creates an interpretive challenge. If the later portions of the king list are historically accurate, why assume the earlier portions are not? If the document's purpose is to record the succession of kingship across time, why would it suddenly shift from fiction to fact partway through? The conventional answer is that mythology blends into history as we move from legendary to verifiable periods. But this assumes the ancients made the same fiction-history distinction we do. The texts give no indication they were mixing genres. They present it all with the same administrative tone. The Sumerians inherited something, whether it was literal truth or deeply believed cultural memory preserved across generations. They documented it as fact. And what they documented was a system where kingship was not a human invention, but a divine institution operated through specific bloodlines descending from beings called Anunnaki. This is the context for everything that follows. The Sumerians were not primitive people inventing colourful origin stories. They were sophisticated urban administrators documenting what they believed to be their historical reality. When they carved into clay that certain kings were born of divine mothers, that kingship descended from heaven, that pre-flood rulers were granted impossibly long lives, they were making records they expected future generations to reference and preserve them we have. Now the question becomes, what exactly were they recording? The pre-flood rulers and their impossible reigns. The Weld Blundell prism, along with fragmentary versions preserved at the University of Pennsylvania, the Ashmolean and other institutions, begins its king list before what it terms the flood, not a flood, the flood, a specific catastrophic event that marks a fundamental division in Sumerian chronology. Before this event, the texts record 8 rulers across 5 cities. The numbers associated with their reigns defy any conventional understanding of human lifespan. In Eridu, Alulim became king and ruled for 28,800 years. Alauyar ruled for 36,000 years. The kingship moved to Bad Tabira, where 3 kings reigned, Enmenluana for 43,200 years, Enmengalana for 28,800 years, and the divine Dumazid for 36,000 years. In Larak, Ensipsiana ruled for 28,800 years. In Sippar, Enmenjurana reigned for 21,000 years. Finally, in Shuruppak, Ubatutu ruled for 18,600 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, total duration 241,200 years. Then the text states, the flood swept over. The mainstream scholarly interpretation treats these numbers as symbolic or mythological. They cannot be literal because humans do not live for tens of thousands of years. Therefore, the numbers must mean something else. Perhaps they represent dynasties rather than individuals. Perhaps they're corrupted sexagesimal calculations. Perhaps they're symbolic expressions of the king's importance. Perhaps they encode astronomical cycles or represent the passage of generations. These are reasonable attempts to reconcile impossible data with biological reality, but they require us to impose meaning the text itself does not indicate. The Sumerian scribes were masters of mathematics and astronomical observation. Their numerical systems were sophisticated. Their administrative records demonstrate precise calculation of agricultural yields, temple revenues, and trade goods. When they wanted to indicate symbolic numbers, they had literary techniques for doing so. The king list does not employ those techniques. It presents the numbers with bureaucratic clarity in the same format used for the historical kings who come later, rulers whose reign lengths are verifiable and reasonable. More significantly, these pre-flood rulers appear in other Sumerian texts, where additional details are provided. They are not vague legendary figures. They have personalities, accomplishments, and specific associations. Alulim, the first king, appears in incantation texts as a wise ruler. Dumuzid, listed as the fifth king at Bad Tabira, becomes a central figure in Sumerian religion as the shepherd god, husband of Inanna, and a dying and rising deity whose cult would influence Mesopotamian religion for millennia. Enmen-Duranar of Sippar is described in later tradition as a sage who received divine revelation, a figure associated with the transmission of sacred knowledge, a prototype for the later Babylonian Emiduranki, who was taken into the company of the gods and taught the secrets of heaven and earth. These figures are not interchangeable names filling slots in a formulaic list. They are embedded in the religious and cultural memory of a civilization. The list records them the same way it records Gilgamesh, a figure who appears both in the king list and in extensive epic narratives, and who ruled the city of Uruk at a period that corresponds roughly to the early dynastic period around 2700 BC. Gilgamesh's inclusion in the king list is instructive. The epic poems describe him as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. His mother was the goddess Ninsun, his father the deified king Lugalbanda. The king list simply notes Gilgamesh, whose father was a phantom, the lord of Kulaba, ruled for 126 years, a human lifespan stretched beyond normal, but not impossibly so. The text acknowledges his mixed parentage by referencing his divine mother through the term phantom, a being not wholly of the mortal world. If Gilgamesh's semi-divine nature merited only a moderately extended reign, what were the pre-flood rulers? The texts describe them not as partially divine, but as ruling in the time when gods and humans shared the earth more directly. This was the era before the separation, before the flood created a rupture between the divine and mortal realms. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 21673 at the University of Pennsylvania, provides additional context. This fragmentary text describes the creation of humanity, the establishment of kingship in 5 cities, the same 5 listed in the king list's pre-flood section, and the decision of the gods to send a flood to destroy humanity. The text is damaged, but enough survives to show that kingship was established by divine decree, that specific cities were chosen as royal centres, and that the flood was not punishment for sin, but rather a divine decision the gods themselves debated. One god, Enki, opposed the flood. The preserved text shows him warning a righteous man named Ziusudra, described as a king and priest. Enki instructs Ziusudra to build a boat and preserve life. After the flood waters recede and Ziusudra offers sacrifice, the text records An and Enlil granted Ziusudra life like a god and gave him eternal life. This is the crucial detail. The pre-flood rulers had lifespans measured in tens of thousands of years. The flood survivor is specifically granted eternal life as a reward. This suggests the pre-flood longevity was not exceptional for that era. It was the norm for rulers of that bloodline. Ziusudra receives as special dispensation what the earlier kings possessed naturally. The pattern suggests a biological reality the texts are documenting, beings who lived on vastly different timescales than historical humans. Whether this represents literal truth, encoded memory of something we don't understand, or mythology describing a cultural belief, the Sumerians were specific about what they recorded. These were not symbolic reigns. They were the actual rulers, documented as factual predecessors to the dynasties that came after. The numbers themselves follow patterns. Many are multiples of 3 to 600, a significant number in Sumerian mathematics called a shah. In their sexagesimal system, this represented a complete cycle. But even accounting for numerical symbolism, the scribes who compiled this list chose these specific values and presented them in a document that transitions seamlessly into verifiable history. The format doesn't change, the tone doesn't shift. The administrative style remains consistent. What happened at the flood? The texts state that kingship descended from heaven again, as if it had been removed and needed to be re-established. When it returned, something had changed. The post-flood rulers showed dramatically reduced lifespans, though still superhuman by modern standards. The first king after the flood, at Kish, ruled for 1200 years, a fraction of pre-flood reigns, but still impossible for modern humans. Subsequent rulers show progressively decreasing lifespans until, within several dynasties, the numbers become plausible. 90 years, 40 years, 36 years, human lifespans. This reads like a genetic dilution, a bloodline retaining exceptional longevity immediately after the catastrophe, then gradually normalizing across generations as it mixed with the broader human population. The scribes documented a transition, a loss of something the earliest rulers possessed fully. The mainstream dismisses this as mythological fancy because the alternative is too strange to accommodate. But the texts are clear. Before the flood, rulers lived for millennia. After the flood, that trait diminished across time, and the key to both periods was a bloodline the gods had established and sought to preserve, a lineage connecting mortal rulers to beings the texts call Anunnaki. The impossibility of the claim does not erase the specificity of the documentation. The Sumerians were recording something. What remains unclear is whether we possess the framework to understand what they were attempting to preserve. Kingship lowered from heaven, not earned, not invented. The Barton cylinder, catalogued as CBS 8383, sits in the University of Pennsylvania Museum alongside the Eridu Genesis tablet. Dating to the mid to late 3rd millennium BC, this creation text begins with the separation of heaven and earth, the establishment of cosmic order, and the founding of cities. The language is explicit. Kingship did not originate with humanity. The text states that after the earth was separated from heaven and humanity was created, the cities were built, given names, and apportioned to divine patrons. Then kingship was lowered from heaven. The Sumerian term is Namlu Golan Ta'ar. Kingship Nama from heaven was brought down Na, not granted, not approved, not symbolically blessed, transferred, physically lowered, as if it were an object, a system, a set of functions that existed in one realm and was moved to another. This phrase appears across multiple Sumerian texts with remarkable consistency. The gods possess something called kingship. They choose to extend it to earth. It descends to specific cities at specific times. The king lists documents which cities held this transferred authority and in what sequence. Kingship is one of the ME, the divine ordinances that govern cosmic reality. The ME are not abstract principles. Sumerian texts describe them almost like programs or protocols, social structures, technologies, religious practices, each one a discrete element of civilization. There are ME for kingship, warfare, priesthood, metalworking, music, writing, sexual union, legal procedures. In the myth Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna tricks the god Enki into giving her numerous ME while he's drunk, then flees with them to her city Uruk. Enki sends monsters to retrieve them, but Inanna escapes, and Uruk permanently gains the civilizing arts. The narrative treats the ME as transferable, possessible, capable of being moved from one location to another. They're not metaphorical concepts, they're functional elements of civilization that require divine approval to operate. Without the ME of kingship, a ruler is just a person with power. With it, that person becomes a conduit of divine order, a nexus where heaven's authority operates on earth. Enlil, the king of the gods, is described repeatedly as the one who grants kingship. Cylinder seals, royal hymns, and mythological texts state that Enlil decrees which city will hold supremacy, which dynasty will rule. how long that rule will last. When a city's power fades, texts explain that Enlil withdrew his favour and transferred kingship elsewhere. This is not merely religious propaganda, it's the worldview that structured Sumerian political reality. But here's the detail that conventional interpretation struggles to address. Kingship is not portrayed as something any human can receive. It operates through specific bloodlines. The gods don't select kings randomly from the human population. They establish royal lineages, and kingship passes through those families. Even when dynasties change cities, from Eridu to Kish to Uruk to Ur, the texts emphasize genealogical connections, claims of descent from earlier rulers, ties to the divine families. The Sumerians had commoners, they had priests, they had merchants, craftsmen, farmers, labourers, but they did not have social mobility into kingship unless one could demonstrate connection to the royal bloodlines. Usurpers existed, certainly military strongmen who seized power, but even these figures, to legitimise their rule, claimed divine selection or married into established royal families. They needed the bloodline, or at least its appearance. Why? If kingship is merely political authority backed by military force, blood descent is irrelevant. A conqueror needs only an army. But Sumerian texts insist on genealogy. King lists include patronymics, Gilgamesh, son of Lugalbanda, Shulgi, son of Ur-Nammu. Royal hymns devote extensive passages to establishing the king's divine ancestry. Temple reliefs show rulers standing before gods in family groupings, as if documenting relationships. This makes sense only if bloodline conveyed something functional. If kingship truly was a transferable divine authority, and if that authority operated through biological descent, then genealogy becomes essential. The king is not merely a political leader, he is a conduit through which divine order flows into human society. His ancestry determines whether he can fulfill that function. The Anunnaki assembly, according to texts like the Enuma Elish and Atrahasis, makes decisions collectively. They debate, vote, decree fates. In this assembly, the decision to grant kingship to humanity is made, and specific terms are established. Humanity will be ruled by kings who serve as intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms. These kings will be partly of divine essence, capable of interfacing with both worlds. This is where the bloodline becomes necessary. Pure humans cannot approach the divine directly. The texts describe this repeatedly, but beings with mixed ancestry can serve as bridges. The king is functional technology, a biological interface through which heaven's directives reach earth. The language is procedural, not metaphorical. The texts describe how kingship is transferred, what qualifications are required, which gods hold authority over the process, what happens when the system is interrupted. When the flood came, kingship was removed, presumably because the bloodline was nearly extinguished. After the flood, it had to be lowered from heaven again, re-established through the survivors who retained the necessary lineage. Later texts describe the crown, the sceptre, the throne as physical objects imbued with divine ME. They're not merely symbols, they're conduits. A person of the proper bloodline, crowned with these objects in a temple before witnesses, undergoes transformation. The texts state that the king becomes divine upon coronation. This is described not as metaphor, but as literal change in status and nature. Consider Shulgi of Uri's hymn, I am a child born of Ninsun. I am the choice of Holy Anne's heart. I am the man whose fate Enlil determined. He's not saying he's blessed like Ninsun's child. He's claiming her as his actual mother, the same goddess who mothered Gilgamesh centuries earlier. This should be impossible, yet Shulgi builds temples to Ninsun, establishes offerings to her and Lugalbanda as his divine parents, and positions himself in Gilgamesh's genealogy. Was he delusional? Was this clever propaganda? Or was Ninsun a title passed through a bloodline, a designation for women who carried the divine ancestry? If kingship requires specific genealogy, then preserving that genealogy requires careful tracking of maternal and paternal lines. Goddess might not mean an immortal supernatural being, but rather a woman of the Anunnaki bloodline, a title denoting biological heritage rather than metaphysical status. This interpretation makes the texts suddenly coherent. Kings claim divine mothers because their mothers held the preserved bloodline. These women are given goddess titles, receive temple cults, appear in official iconography because they are the carriers of the essential genetic heritage. Without them, the next generation cannot legitimately rule. The sacred marriage ritual, which we'll examine more closely later, operates within this framework. The king must ritually unite with a representative of Inanna annually. This isn't symbolic, it's bloodline maintenance. Each generation must renew the connection to the divine lineage, or kingship fails. Kingship was not invented by humans. It was not earned through military prowess or political cunning. It was lowered from heaven, transferred from divine hands to specific bloodlines, and maintained through careful genealogical preservation. The Sumerians documented this with administrative precision because to them it was not mythology, it was the constitutional foundation of their civilization. The question is not whether they believed this. The texts prove they did. The question is what they were actually documenting when they described a system where rulership descended from beings called Anunnaki and operated through biological lineage, the Anunnaki assembly, who grants the bloodline. To understand the bloodline, you must first understand the Anunnaki, not as they're portrayed in modern reinterpretations, but as the Sumerian texts actually describe them. These were not abstract cosmic forces. They were specific beings with names, genealogies, roles, and documented interactions with humanity. The word Anunnaki appears throughout Mesopotamian literature from the earliest Sumerian texts through Babylonian and Assyrian sources spanning nearly 3 millennia. The term's meaning is preserved in its components, a new heaven plus na Ophron plus Ki, those who from heaven to earth came. This is not modern theorizing, this is what the Sumerian words themselves signify. In the earliest texts, the Anunnaki function as an assembly or council of divine beings. They are distinct from the Igigi, another class of deities who serve as labourers or messengers. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets including BM 78941 and BM 78943 at the British Museum, describes this hierarchy explicitly. The Igigi perform exhausting labour, digging rivers, canals, and irrigation channels until they rebel. The Anunnaki Council convenes to address the crisis. They decide to create humanity as a replacement labour force, mixing clay with divine blood to produce beings capable of work, but subordinate to divine authority. This is not creation from nothing. This is biological engineering. The text describes the process with procedural specificity. The god Wei-Ila or Geshtu-i, depending on the version, is slain, his blood mixed with clay, and from this mixture the first humans are fashioned. The goddess Nintu, also called Mami or Beletili, oversees the creation, shaping 7 males and 7 females. These prototype humans are then multiplied to provide workforce for the gods. The creation story is not about spiritual origins, it's about labour management. Humanity is manufactured to serve a function, to work the fields, maintain the irrigation systems, provide offerings to sustain the gods' earthly operations. The Anunnaki are administrators, managers of Earth, as a resource extraction operation. Humanity is their solution to a labour shortage, but within this utilitarian framework, something more complex emerges. The divine blood used in humanity's creation means humans carry a trace of the Anunnaki essence. Not much, just enough to make humans intelligent, capable of language, able to follow complex instructions. But that trace creates a problem. Humans are now partly divine. The boundary between Anunnaki and humanity is not absolute. This becomes critical when addressing kingship. If ordinary humans carry a fragment of divine essence, what distinguishes kings? The answer, according to the texts, is concentration. Kings are not 1% divine and 99% human like common people. They're 50%, 67%, or even higher significant admixtures that place them in an intermediate category. Gilgamesh is explicitly described as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. This is not symbolic. The mathematics of it is taken seriously enough to calculate proportions. How does one achieve such high percentages of divine ancestry? Through direct parentage. A human mother and Anunnaki father produces a 50-50 hybrid. That hybrid mating with another of similar heritage maintains the ratio. The texts describe precisely this pattern. Gods taking human wives, goddesses bearing children to human kings, royal dynasties preserving their bloodline through careful marriage alliances. The Anunnaki assembly oversees this process. In the Enuma Elish creation epic, preserved on tablets including K3473 from Nineveh's library, the gods gather to decree fates and establish cosmic order. The text describes their council chambers, their deliberations, their hierarchical structure, and presides as king of heaven. Enlil commands the earth. Enki manages the Abzu, Freshta underground Shin, and serves as chief of wisdom and magic. Ninasag Nintu oversees childbirth and creation. Each has defined domains, and together they govern reality. These are not metaphorical roles. Sumerian kings received directives from specific Anunnaki regarding specific matters. Enlil grants kingship. This appears in dozens of royal inscriptions, and determines ultimate fate, invoked in prayers and oaths. Enki provides wisdom and technical knowledge, credited with teaching humanity arts and sciences. Inanna oversees warfare and political power. City-states conduct wars in her name and divide spoils according to her temple's requirements. The gods are not worshipped in vague generalized terms. Each has a cult center, a specific temple, a priesthood that maintains rituals, and economic holdings that generate revenue. The Temple of Enlil at Nippur held vast agricultural estates. Inanna's temple at Uruk received tithes from military campaigns. Enki's shrine at Eridu was the oldest continuously maintained religious site in Mesopotamia, with archaeological evidence of ritual activity extending back to the mid-6th millennium BC. These temples were not churches in our modern sense, places where people gather to worship an invisible deity. They were residences. The god dwelled there. Daily rituals fed, clothed, and entertained the god through cult statues that served as focal points for divine presence. The god owned property, employed workers, conducted business. Temple archives document loans made in the god's name, commercial contracts, even legal disputes where the temple sued or was sued. This makes sense only if the god was understood as an actual person, perhaps not resident in the temple continuously, but represented there through administrative proxies. The king served as chief intermediary. He reported to the gods, received instructions, implemented divine policy, but he could do this only if he possessed the biological credentials, the bloodline that made him capable of interfacing between realms. The Anunnaki, in this framework, are the senior management. Humanity is the workforce, and kings are middle management, beings of mixed heritage who can communicate with both groups. This explains why kingship cannot be claimed by just anyone. You can't promote yourself into a position that requires specific biological capability. The bloodline is functional, not symbolic. When the Anunnaki assembly decides to grant kingship to a city, they're not giving abstract approval. They're transferring operational authority to a qualified individual of appropriate heritage. That person becomes responsible for maintaining Ma, the Egyptian concept, or Mi, the Sumerian equivalent, cosmic order in their territory. They ensure justice, organize labor, manage resources, conduct rituals, wage wars against chaos and disorder. They are the divine system's earthly operating nodes. This is why royal genealogies matter so intensely, why king lists track paternity with precision, why sacred marriage rituals renew the bloodline annually, why queens and royal mothers are documented with divine titles. The system only functions if the biological component is maintained. The texts describe the Anunnaki making these decisions collectively. They debate humanity's fate before the flood. They decide which cities receive kingship. They determine how long dynasties will endure. These are not cosmic forces acting through mysterious providence. These are beings in council chambers making administrative decisions about their territorial holdings on Earth. Were they immortal? The texts suggest vastly extended lifespans, but not absolute immortality. Gods could be killed. The creation stories include divine deaths. They could grow weary. The Igigi rebellion happened because divine labour was exhausting. They required food and drink. Daily offerings sustained them. They mated, produced children, conducted politics and intrigue among themselves. They were not transcendent in the way monotheistic religions conceive of God. They were powerful, long-lived, knowledgeable beings with capabilities humans lacked. But they operated within physical reality, maintained presence on Earth, and interacted with humanity in procedural, documented ways. The bloodline that ruled early civilization was granted by this assembly. Specific Anunnaki took human partners or granted their own children as spouses to human rulers. The resulting hybrid lineages were recognized as legitimate bearers of kingship. And the Sumerians documented this across centuries in bureaucratic records, royal genealogies, and ritual texts that describe precisely how the system operated. The question is not whether they believed this. They clearly did. The question is what historical reality produced a civilization-wide belief that their rulers descended from beings who came from heaven and established bloodlines through direct biological intervention. Ninsun and Lugalbanda, the divine parents of kings. In the Louvre Museum in Paris, catalogued as AO 2761, there exists a fragmentary limestone relief from the late 3rd millennium BC. The carved surface shows a seated figure, long-haired, wearing the flounced robe that iconographically marks divinity in Mesopotamian art. A damaged inscription identifies the figure as Ninsun, not a representation of the goddess Ninsun. The inscription reads as if this is her image, commissioned during her lifetime or shortly after, preserved as documentation of an actual individual. This relief received offerings in antiquity. Ninsun had a temple cult. Priests maintained daily rituals in her name. Kings of the Ur III dynasty, ruling around 2100-2000 BC, made offerings to her and Lugalbanda as their divine ancestors. Ninsun appears in literature as the mother of the hero Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in multiple versions across a millennium, introduces her in the first tablet, Ninsun the wild cow, wise and intelligent, who knows all things. Gilgamesh consults his mother before undertaking his journey to the cedar forest. She performs rituals, prays to the sun god Shamash on her son's behalf, and adopts Gilgamesh's companion Enkidu as her own son. She speaks, acts, advises. She is characterized not as a distant cosmic principle, but as a mother involved in her child's life. The texts are explicit about the parentage. Ninsun is Gilgamesh's mother. Lugalbanda is his father. Both are described with the determinative sign for divinity. Both have temple cults. Both receive offerings. Both appear in royal genealogies spanning centuries. Lugalbanda himself is listed in the Sumerian king list as an early ruler of Uruk, credited with a reign of 1,000-1,200 years, post-flood, but still superhuman in duration. Sumerian poems describe his adventures, his relationship with the gods, his marriage to Ninsun. He is a figure at the boundary between myth and history, too specific and well documented to be purely legendary, too distant and impossible to be straightforwardly historical by modern standards. But here's what cannot be dismissed. Later kings claimed descent from this couple. Not symbolic descent, not spiritual inheritance, biological genealogy. Shogi, greatest king of Ur's third dynasty, ruled from approximately 2093-2046 BCE. He is historically verified. We have his building inscriptions, administrative records from his reign, dated tablets documenting his government policies. This is not a legendary figure. He was a real person who governed a real empire, and in his self-praise hymns, composed in the first person and distributed throughout his realm, he makes an impossible claim: I am a child born of Ninsun. I am the choice of Holy Anne's heart. I am the man whose fate Enlil determined. Not I am blessed, like a child of Ninsun. Not Ninsun favours me as a son. He states biological maternity. His father was Ur-Nammu, founder of the Ur-3 dynasty, himself a historical ruler. But his mother, Shulgi claims, was the goddess Ninsun, the same figure who bore Gilgamesh 5 or 6 centuries earlier. The mainstream interpretation treats this as metaphor or propaganda, a king claiming divine favour through poetic language. But this interpretation requires ignoring what Shulgi actually did. He didn't just write poems. He established a permanent cult for Ninsun and Lugalbanda, funding daily offerings, appointing priests, dedicating temple space. He constructed these cults in multiple cities, Ur, Nippur, Uruk. He positioned himself legally and ritually as their descendant, entitling himself to their temple properties and religious authority. If this were merely propaganda, why the extensive institutional infrastructure? Propaganda is cheap, write some poems, commission some inscriptions, claim divine favour. But Shulgi committed massive resources to maintaining cults for his claimed divine parents, resources that could have gone to military campaigns, building projects, or personal enrichment. Why? The only economically rational explanation is that these cults served a function beyond propaganda. They legitimized his rule through demonstrable bloodline. If kingship operates through genealogical descent from the Anunnaki, and if Ninsun and Lugalbanda represent that lineage, then maintaining their cults isn't optional luxury, it's political necessity. It's Shulgi documenting his credentials. But how can a woman who gave birth to Gilgamesh around 2700 BC also be the mother of Shulgi around 2100 BC? 6 centuries separate them. No human woman lives that long. 3 possibilities emerge. First, the texts are entirely fictional, and both Gilgamesh and Shulgi are inventing divine mothers for political purposes. This seems unlikely given Gilgamesh's historical attestation and the extensive literary tradition surrounding him that treats him as a real historical figure. Second, Ninsun was not a single individual, but a title or designation passed through a matrilineal line. Each generation, the woman carrying the divine bloodline would hold the title and role of Ninsun. She would serve as the goddess's earthly representative, perhaps even her avatar or embodied presence. When a king claims Ninsun as his mother, he means the current holder of that role, a woman of the sacred bloodline. Third, the texts mean what they say. Ninsun was a being with lifespan measured in centuries or millennia, capable of bearing children across generations. The pre-flood rulers lived for tens of thousands of years. Post-flood figures show reduced but still superhuman longevity. If Ninsun belonged to the Anunnaki lineage, perhaps a hybrid herself, then her lifespan would naturally exceed human norms. The second interpretation, Ninsun as title, makes the most sense for explaining institutional continuity, but it requires accepting that bloodline was tracked with precision, that specific women were designated as carriers of divine ancestry, and that their children were automatically qualified for kingship because of that maternal heritage. This pattern appears across Mesopotamian history. Gilgamesh's mother is divine. Shulgi's mother is divine. The kings of Akkad claim descent from the goddess Ishtar, another name for Inanna. The Babylonian king Hammurabi traces his lineage to Marduk through generations of divine human intermarriage. It's not isolated poetic fancy, it's systematic genealogical documentation spanning dynasties and centuries. Why the mothers specifically? In the text describing humanity's creation, the goddess Nintu Ninasag shapes the first humans. The maternal role in creation is emphasized, the womb as the sacred space where divine essence and mortal flesh combine. If the bloodline passes through women, then tracking maternal descent becomes essential. The king's father might be human, but if his mother carries the divine lineage, he inherits qualification for kingship. This would explain why royal women are documented with such care, why queens consort receive temple cults, why king lists sometimes note maternal parentage. Gilgamesh, whose father was a phantom, the son of Ninsun. The mother matters more than the father because she carries the functional component, the genetic heritage that enables divine-human interface. Lugalbanda himself appears to be a transitional figure. The texts describe him as originally human, later deified. He marries Ninsun, a goddess. Their union produces Gilgamesh, the archetypal hero king. Lugalbanda represents the human side of the equation, but he is elevated through his marriage into the divine family. This becomes the template, a human male of appropriate qualities, strength, wisdom, leadership, joins with a divine female, and their offspring are qualified to rule. The sacred marriage ritual, performed annually by Mesopotamian kings, replicates this pattern. The king ritually unites with a representative of Inanna. In some eras, this was the high priestess. In others, the queen played this role. The ritual ensured that each year the connection between the divine and human realms was renewed through the king's body. He was re-legitimized, reauthorized, biologically reconnected to the divine source of his authority. If this sounds like fertility magic, consider what the texts actually describe. The ritual occurs in the temple bedchamber. A sacred marriage bed is prepared. Offerings are made. The king and goddess, or her representative, engage in sexual union. The text explicitly states this is to ensure the fertility of the land, the prosperity of the people, and the stability of the kingship. This is not abstract symbolism. It's described as a functional ritual with specific procedural steps and expected outcomes. Could this be symbolic? Perhaps. But the consistency across sources, the institutional resources devoted to it, the fact that kings who failed to perform it were considered illegitimate, all suggest this was understood as literally necessary. The bloodline required renewal. Each generation risked dilution. The sacred marriage ritual was the mechanism by which the divine genetic component was reinforced. Ninsun and Lugalbanda are not merely characters in myths. They're documented ancestors of historical rulers who built them temple cults, made them offerings, and claimed their bloodline as the source of royal legitimacy. Whether they were immortal beings, titles held by succession of individuals, or something else we lack framework to understand, the Sumerians treated them as real, and the genealogies descending from them were understood to convey actual functional authority to rule. The texts are clear, the institutions are documented, the pattern spans centuries. What remains unclear is what biological or genetic reality the Sumerians were attempting to preserve through this obsessive tracking of divine maternal bloodlines. Shulgi's impossible claim, I am born of Ninsun. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature preserves multiple hymns attributed to King Shulgi of Ur, compositions written in the first person that describe his achievements, his divine nature, and his royal authority. These are not third-party accounts written after his death. They are texts circulated during his reign, bearing his name, distributed throughout his kingdom as official royal literature. Hymn D, which we examined in detail through Oxford's translation, begins with conventional royal praise, O my king, great bull with splendid limbs, dragon with a lion's eyes. But within 40 lines, the text makes its genealogical claim explicit. Shepherd Shulgi, when your seed was placed in the holy womb, your mother Ninsun gave birth to you, your personal god, holy Lugalbanda, fashioned you. This is not buried in obscure fragments. It's prominent, central, repeated. Shulgi claims Ninsun as mother and Lugalbanda as father. The text continues, I am a child born of Ninsun. I am the choice of Holy Anne's heart. I am the man whose fate Enlil determined. Why would a powerful king, at the height of his empire, commanding resources across Mesopotamia, make a claim that appears absurd? Shulgi ruled a vast territory. He commissioned extensive building projects. He reformed administrative systems, standardized measurements, established schools. He campaigned militarily, expanding Yu's influence. He was competent, effective, and successful by any measure. Such a man does not casually claim impossible ancestry unless that claim serves a critical function, and the function it served was legitimacy through bloodline. Earth III was a new dynasty. Shulgi's father Ur-Nammu had seized power after the Gutian period, a time of foreign domination when mountain peoples ruled Mesopotamian cities. Ur-Nammu expelled the Gutians and established himself as king, but his claim to rule was military prowess, not ancient bloodline. He was a usurper, albeit a successful and popular one. Shulgi, inheriting his father's throne, faced a legitimacy problem. He had military power, he had administrative capability, but did he have the bloodline? Could he claim descent from the royal houses of old, from the dynasties that traced their ancestry to the gods? His solution was brilliant and audacious: claim connection to the most prestigious bloodline in Mesopotamian tradition. Gilgamesh, the greatest hero king, descended from Ninsun and Lugalbanda. Shulgi would position himself as their descendant as well, placing himself in Gilgamesh's genealogical line. This wasn't merely poetic, it was constitutional. If kingship required divine ancestry, Shulgi needed to document his credentials. But claiming is one thing, institutionalizing the claim is another. Shulgi didn't just write poems, he built infrastructure to support his genealogical assertion. First, he established or renewed the cult of Ninsun and Lugalbanda in providing them with permanent endowments. Temple records document offerings made to them during his reign. This wasn't token support. These cults received ongoing funding, priesthoods, and ritual schedules. Second, he built or renovated temples to them in multiple cities, Nippur, Uruk, and others. This geographic distribution ensured that his claimed ancestry was recognized across his realm. Each temple served as physical evidence of his connection to the divine couple. Third, he commissioned extensive literary works describing his relationship to them. Multiple hymns reference his divine parentage. These texts were copied in scribal schools, becoming part of the educational curriculum. Future generations of scribes would learn to read and write by copying texts about Shulgi's divine ancestry. Fourth, he claimed brotherhood with Gilgamesh. In one hymn, the text describes Shulgi walking alongside Gilgamesh as his brother, both of them children of the divine parents. This placed Shulgi in the legendary Uruk dynasty's lineage, despite his family's recent rise to power in This is not the behaviour of a man perpetuating a metaphor. This is systematic legitimation through genealogical documentation. Shulgi was building a legal case supported by institutional infrastructure to prove his bloodline qualified him to rule. The question becomes, did he believe it? Did his subjects? Or was everyone participating in elaborate political theatre? The resources committed suggest genuine belief. Maintaining temple cults was expensive. Priests required salaries, buildings needed maintenance, offerings consumed resources. For this to be mere propaganda, Shulgi would need his entire administrative apparatus to collaborate in expensive performance art. Possible, but economically inefficient. More likely, the culture genuinely believed bloodline mattered. Whether Shulgi's specific claim to Ninsun and Lugalbanda was accepted at face value or understood as metaphorical connection to their lineage through marriage or adoption, the principle was real. Kings needed divine ancestry. This explains his self-deification during his reign. Unlike earlier Mesopotamian rulers, who were deified after death, Shulgi declared himself divine while living. Inscriptions from the latter part of his reign include the determinative sign for divinity before his name. He received cult worship in temples. Oaths were sworn by his name. He claimed the status of a god. Why? Because if his mother was the goddess Ninsun, he possessed sufficient divine heritage to qualify for divine status himself. He wasn't making a radical innovation, he was claiming the logical consequence of his parentage. If Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine because of Ninsun, Shulgi could claim similar proportion through the same maternal line. This pattern would continue through Mesopotamian history. Later kings would claim divine descent, establish temple cults for their divine ancestors, and position themselves as intermediaries between heaven and earth. The Babylonian king Hammurabi, famous for his law code, claimed descent from Marduk and received kingship from the sun god Shamash. The Assyrian kings traced their lineage to the gods Assur and Ishtar. The pattern was consistent, legitimate kingship required divine bloodline, and kings documented that bloodline through institutional means. But Shulgi's case is particularly striking because of its impossible chronology. Ninsun bore Gilgamesh around 2700 BC, she bore Shulgi around 2100 BC. 6 centuries separate them. For Shulgi's claim to be literal, Ninsun would need lifespan measured in centuries, unless, as suggested earlier, Ninsun was a title held by successive women of the bloodline. Each queen or priestess carrying the divine ancestry would embody Ninsun. She would serve in the goddess's temple, perform her rituals, represent her on earth. When a king claimed Ninsun as his mother, he meant the current incarnation of that role, a woman who genetically carried the lineage from previous generations. This would make Shulgi's claim functional rather than absurd. His mother, whoever she was, held the Ninsun title and bloodline. By being born of her, he inherited the genetic credentials for kingship. He then documented this through institutional means, establishing her cult, claiming the divine ancestors, positioning himself in the genealogy. This interpretation makes the system coherent. Bloodline is tracked through maternal descent. Specific women are designated as carriers of the divine genetic heritage. Their children are automatically qualified for kingship because of that inheritance, and kings, to prove their legitimacy, must demonstrate their maternal connection to the sacred bloodline. Whether the Sumerians understood this in terms of genetics, lick, or in terms of divine essence transmitted through blood, the functional result is the same. Genealogy matters, mothers matter more than fathers, and the continuity of civilization depends on preserving the bloodline that connects mortal rulers to the Anunnaki who established kingship in the first place. Shulgi's impossible claim was his proof of eligibility, and he backed that claim with institutional infrastructure that lasted for generations, embedding his divine ancestry into the cultural and legal foundation of his empire. The texts don't allow us to dismiss this as mere propaganda. The resources committed were too substantial. The consistency across sources was too precise. The cultural belief in bloodline as functional requirement for kingship was too deeply embedded. Shulgi believed he descended from divine parents. His people believed it, and the civilization organized itself around preserving and documenting such ancestries across centuries. Whether the ancestry was literal or whether it represented something we lack framework to fully understand, the Sumerians took it seriously, and they recorded it with the same bureaucratic precision they applied to documenting grain shipments and temple revenues. The sacred marriage ritual, maintaining the bloodline. In the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, catalogued as Istanbul #2461, there exists a clay tablet approximately 4,000 years old. The text inscribed on it is called the Love Song for Shusin, named after a king of the Ur-3 dynasty who ruled around 2000 BCA. The tablet preserves a poem describing intimate devotion between a man and woman, with sensual imagery and direct expression of desire. But this is not private love poetry. This is liturgical text. It was performed as part of the sacred marriage ritual, an annual ceremony where the Mesopotamian king ritually united with a representative of the goddess Inanna. The tablet itself notes that the poem was performed during the New Year festival in the context of the sacred marriage rite. The mainstream scholarly interpretation treats this ritual as sympathetic magic, a symbolic act intended to ensure agricultural fertility through imitative principle. The king represents the god Dumuzid, shepherd king and consort of Inanna. A priestess or queen represents Inanna. Their ritual union symbolizes the productive marriage of earth and heaven, ensuring the land's fertility and the kingdom's prosperity. It's treated as theatre, meaningful but not literal. But the texts describing the ritual use surprisingly physical language. They detail the preparation of the marriage bed, the adornment of the bedchamber, the offerings made before the encounter, and the union itself. The ritual culminates in sexual intercourse described with explicit vocabulary. This was not a symbolic gesture or a dramatized blessing. The king and goddess, or her representatives, had sex. The texts state this clearly. Why? Not for entertainment, not for royal pleasure. The ritual was obligatory, performed annually, understood as essential to the kingdom's survival. A king who failed to perform the sacred marriage was considered illegitimate. His reign was unstable, his crops would fail, his people would suffer. The ritual had to be conducted, and it had to be done correctly. One Sumerian text describes the preparation. For my lord there is made a bed, plants are brought there. For my king there is made a bed, plants are brought there. The bedchamber is decorated, offerings are placed, incense is burned. Then Inanna bathes for the king, she bathes for the king, Dumuzid bathes with her, milk and cream are poured before her. The language is procedural, describing specific actions in sequence. After these preparations, the text describes the union. The king goes with lifted head to the holy lap of Inanna. And later, he puts his arms around her. He says to her, "My beautiful one, your breast is delight." This continues with remarkable frankness. The texts don't euphemize. They describe sexual union with clarity, including references to pleasure, desire, and mutual satisfaction. This was not clinical duty. It was described as joyful, intimate, fulfilling. But why was it necessary? If this is purely symbolic fertility magic, any priest could perform it. Why specifically the king, and why annually? And why, if the king failed to perform it, did the kingdom suffer? The answer returns to bloodline. If kingship operates through genetic heritage from the Anunnaki, and if that heritage dilutes across generations, then each generation requires renewal of the divine component. The sacred marriage ritual was the mechanism by which this occurred. Consider the pattern. The king, who possesses partial divine ancestry, unites with a representative of Inanna, the goddess most associated with earthly kingship and fertility. Inanna herself, according to myth, descended from the Anunnaki assembly. She is daughter of Anu or Nana, depending on the text, connected to the divine bloodline. When the king unites with her representative, he is not merely performing symbolic magic. He is biologically reconnecting to the divine lineage. If the priestess or queen who represents Inanna is herself of the bloodline, a woman carrying the preserved divine ancestry, perhaps a descendant of previous sacred marriages, then the king's union with her serves multiple functions. It legitimizes his rule by demonstrating his connection to the goddess. It ensures any children born will carry enhanced divine heritage. It renews the cosmic order by re-establishing the proper relationship between divine and mortal realms. This makes the ritual functional rather than merely symbolic. The kingdom's prosperity depends not on magical sympathetic principles, but on the king maintaining his genetic credentials. If bloodline is what enables him to interface with divine authority, then preserving that bloodline is not optional, it's constitutional necessity. This also explains why the ritual is annual. Genetic heritage dilutes over time if not reinforced. Each year, without renewal, weakens the king's connection to the divine source of his authority. The sacred marriage ritual was the society's mechanism for preventing that degradation. Evidence for this interpretation appears in how seriously the ritual was taken. It wasn't performed casually or optionally, it was required, scheduled, documented. Temple records from multiple periods reference preparations for the sacred marriage, including extensive expenditures on materials, offerings, and ceremonial objects. This was a major state event consuming significant resources. Moreover, queens who participated in the ritual were given divine titles and received temple cults. They weren't mere political wives, they were elevated to goddess status, treated as embodiments of Inanna, and worshipped alongside the king. This makes sense only if they were understood to carry the divine bloodline themselves. They weren't random women playing a ritual role, they were specific individuals selected because of their ancestry. The historical record shows that royal marriages in Mesopotamia were extremely selective. Kings didn't marry for love or political alliance alone. They married women from specific families, often from priestly lines associated with temples of Inanna or other goddesses. These women brought more than political connections, they brought bloodline credentials. When the king performed the sacred marriage with such a woman, he was ensuring that his heir, born of his partial divine ancestry combined with her bloodline, would have sufficient divine heritage to rule legitimately. The child born of this union would be qualified for kingship because both parents carried the necessary genetic credentials. This also explains the obsessive documentation of royal mothers. The king lists sometimes note X, son of Y and Z. The mother's identity matters because she contributes the critical bloodline component. If she's from the correct lineage, her children are qualified. If she's not, they lack legitimacy despite the father's kingship. The sacred marriage ritual in this framework was not symbolic fertility magic. It was the civilization's mechanism for maintaining the bloodline that connected their rulers to the Anunnaki. Each year, the ritual renewed that connection. Each generation, careful marriage selection ensured the bloodline remained concentrated enough to function. And when the bloodline finally degraded too much, when the divine component diluted beyond recovery, kingship itself ended. This is precisely what we see in Mesopotamian history. After the Ur-3 dynasty, the last to claim living divine status, the pattern changes. Later kings still claim divine favour, but they don't claim divine parentage as Gilgamesh and Shulgi did. They don't establish temple cults to their divine mothers. The confident assertion I am born of Ninsun disappears from royal hymns. What happened? Either the cultural belief changed, or the actual bloodline was lost. If kingship required specific genetic heritage, and if that heritage was maintained through sacred marriage rituals and careful maternal selection, then loss of the bloodline would mean loss of legitimate kingship. Later dynasties would rule by military force and political authority alone, without the biological credentials that earlier kings possessed. The texts describing the sacred marriage don't allow us to dismiss it as merely symbolic. The ritual was too expensive, too central, too carefully documented. The participants were too specific, too carefully selected, too consistently elevated to divine status. The consequences of failing to perform it were too serious. The Sumerians understood this ritual as essential to their civilization's functioning. Whether the mechanism was literally genetic, or whether it involved some aspect of reality we lack framework to understand, they treated it as biological necessity. The king's body was the interface between divine and mortal realms. The bloodline made that interface possible, and the sacred marriage ritual maintained the bloodline across generations. Without it, kingship would fail. Without it, the connection to the Anunnaki would sever. Without it, the divine order established at the beginning of civilization would collapse. The texts are clear, the institutions are documented, the pattern is consistent. The sacred marriage ritual was not theatre. It was the functional mechanism by which a civilization maintained the bloodline that linked their rulers to the beings who had established kingship when it first descended from heaven. Adapa, the template for divine human hybrid. Among the texts discovered in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, among the flood stories and creation epics and king lists, there exists a fragmentary narrative about a man named Adapa. Unlike Gilgamesh, whose exploits fill multiple tablets, and whose name appears in king lists and historical records, Adapa exists in only one extended narrative, but his story serves as a template, a prototype for understanding how divine human hybrids function within Mesopotamian cosmology. Adapa is not born naturally. The text states explicitly that he was created by Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh waters. Enki fashioned Adapa as a human, but endowed him with exceptional qualities. Wide understanding he perfected for him, wisdom he had given him, eternal life he did not give him. This is critical phrasing. Adapa possesses divine wisdom. He has capabilities beyond normal humanity, but he is mortal. He is the intermediate being, more than human, less than God. Enki created him deliberately as a hybrid, giving him divine attributes while withholding the crucial element of immortality. Why? The text explains that Adapa serves as a priest and advisor to Enki. He tends the god's shrine at Eridu, performs rituals, makes offerings, and manages the temple's affairs. He is Enki's human intermediary, the interface through which the god interacts with mortal society. Adapa can understand divine instructions and translate them into human action. He can comprehend cosmic wisdom and teach it to people. He bridges the gap between mortal limitation and divine knowledge. In this role, Adapa is the prototype for the king. Later royal ideology would assign precisely these functions to the ruler: tend the god's temples, perform rituals, receive divine wisdom, implement heavenly decrees on earth. The king is Adapa writ large, a being of mixed nature serving as intermediary. The story continues with a crisis. While fishing to provide offerings for Enki's temple, Adapa encounters the south wind, which capsizes his boat. In anger, Adapa utters a curse that breaks the wing of the south wind, stopping its blowing for 7 days. This disruption of cosmic order brings him to the attention of An, king of heaven, and summons Adapa to heaven to answer for his actions. Enki, concerned for his creation, advises Adapa how to behave when he enters the divine realm. Crucially, Enki warns him, "They will offer you food of death, do not eat it. They will offer you water of death, do not drink it." Adapa obeys. He travels to heaven, stands before An and the assembled gods, and explains his actions. The gods are impressed by his wisdom and eloquence. An, moved by Adapa's respectful demeanour and Enki's intercession, decides to grant Adapa immortality. He orders food and water of life to be brought forth. But Adapa, remembering Enki's warning, refuses both, and is confused. Why did you not eat? Why did you not drink? Now you cannot have eternal life. Adapa realizes the tragedy. Enki's warning was either mistaken or deliberately deceptive. Adapa was offered immortality, the one thing he lacked, and refused it because of his creator god's instruction. He returns to earth, still mortal, still limited, forever denied the opportunity to transcend his hybrid nature. The tale ends with Adapa bringing divine wisdom to humanity, teaching the arts of civilization, religious rituals, healing practices, but himself remaining mortal. He is the template for humanity's condition, possessing divine knowledge, capable of understanding cosmic principles, but trapped in mortal flesh, subject to death. This narrative explains the Mesopotamian view of the divine human bloodline. Pure humans lack divine wisdom, they're capable of physical labour, but not cosmic understanding. Pure gods possess wisdom and immortality, but are distant from earthly affairs. The hybrid, beings like Adapa, and by extension the kings, occupy the middle ground. They have enough divine essence to comprehend heavenly wisdom, but enough mortality to dwell on earth and engage with human society. This is why kingship requires the bloodline. A pure human cannot perform the king's function. He lacks the necessary capability to interface with divine reality, but a hybrid can. The divine component of his nature enables him to receive revelation, understand cosmic order, communicate with gods. The human component enables him to dwell among people, understand their needs, and implement divine wisdom in practical form. Adappa's story also reveals the limitation of the hybrid state. He is powerful, but not all-powerful, wise, but not all-knowing. He can be deceived, even by his creator. He is subject to death, despite his divine attributes. This matches what we see in the royal genealogies. Kings with divine parentage still die. They may reign for extended periods. Gilgamesh is 126 years, Lugalbander's 1200 years, but they are not immortal in the way the gods are. The bloodline grants capability, but not transcendence. It enables function, but imposes limitation. This is why the sacred marriage ritual must be renewed annually. This is why the bloodline must be carefully preserved across generations. Without constant maintenance, the divine component degrades. The hybrid status weakens. Eventually, the bloodline becomes indistinguishable from common humanity, and kingship loses its functional foundation. Later Mesopotamian tradition develops the figure of the Apkallu, 7 sages sent by Enki before the flood to teach humanity civilization. Adappa is identified as the first of these Apkallu. The others are also described as human-divine hybrids, created by the gods to serve as teachers and culture bringers. After the flood, no more Apkallu are sent. Instead, that role falls to kings, rulers who carry the bloodline and serve as repositories of divine wisdom. This succession, from pre-flood Apkallu to post-flood kings, shows how the Mesopotamians understood the transmission of civilization. It wasn't invented by humans stumbling through trial and error. It was taught by beings who combined divine knowledge with human embodiment. And when those beings were no longer present, their role was filled by rulers who inherited their mixed nature through bloodline descent. Adappa never appears in the king lists. He is not a ruler, but a priest, a sage, a teacher. Yet his story provides the conceptual framework for understanding what royal bloodline meant. He is the explicit example of what kings claimed implicitly: divine wisdom in mortal flesh, created through intentional mixture of God and human, capable of bridging the realms. The text even describes how this mixing occurs. Enki fashioned Adappa. The phrasing is similar to the creation of humanity in Atrahasis, clay mixed with divine blood, shaped by divine hands. Adappa is intentionally manufactured to possess specific qualities. He is not an accident or a mutation. He is designed, crafted, engineered to serve a function. If Adappa represents intentional creation of a divine human hybrid for functional purposes, then the royal bloodlines represent the perpetuation of that same principle. The kings are not random individuals blessed by gods. They are descendants of deliberate divine human unions, carrying in their bodies the mixed heritage that enables them to fulfill their role. Adappa's denial of immortality also matters. He could have transcended his hybrid state and become fully divine, but he remained mortal, dwelling among humanity, serving as their intermediary and teacher. This is precisely what kings are supposed to do: remain connected to their people while channeling divine wisdom and authority. The tale's tragic element, Adappa's missed opportunity for eternal life, may reflect a historical truth preserved in mythological form. At some point, the possibility of transcendence was lost. The bloodline degraded. What the earliest kings possessed fully, the divine component that granted extended lifespan and direct communication with the gods, later generations retained only partially. Eventually, it was lost entirely, and kingship became purely political authority rather than cosmic intermediation. Adappa is the template. He shows us how the Mesopotamians understood the mechanism of divine human hybridization. He demonstrates what such beings can and cannot do. He explains why they're necessary. Neither pure humans nor pure gods can bridge the realms. Only the mixed being, the intentional hybrid, possessing attributes of both, can serve that function. And that function, receiving divine wisdom, implementing heavenly order on earth, maintaining the connection between realms, was precisely what kingship required. The bloodline provided it. The royal genealogies documented it. The texts preserve the template that explains it all. Adapa, the first hybrid, created by Enki to serve as intermediary, possessing divine wisdom but mortal flesh, capable of more than humanity but less than divinity. This is what the Anunnaki bloodline meant. This is what the kings descended from. Not metaphorical divine favour, but functional hybrid nature, documented as intentional creation, preserved across generations through careful genealogical maintenance, and eventually lost when the bloodline could no longer be sustained. The flood and the bloodline's interruption. The flood appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts as a pivotal event that nearly destroys humanity and fundamentally alters the relationship between the divine and mortal realms. It is not a punishment for sin in the Sumerian version, not a moral judgment delivered by an offended deity. It is an administrative decision made by the Anunnaki assembly, debated among the gods, and executed despite internal dissent. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 10673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, provides the earliest Sumerian account. The text is fragmentary, but what survives shows kingship being established in 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, precisely the cities mentioned in the king list's pre-flood section. The tablet describes humanity multiplying, cities growing, noise increasing, then a break in the text. When the narrative resumes, the gods are in assembly, deciding to destroy humanity with a flood. The Atrahasis epic, preserved more completely in Babylonian versions, provides additional details. The text explains that humanity's proliferation created problems for the gods. Humans were too numerous, too loud, too disruptive. The noise prevented the gods from sleeping. Multiple times, the Anunnaki attempt population control. They send plague, drought, famine. Each time, the god Enki subverts their efforts, instructing his priest Atrahasis how to avoid the disaster. Finally, Enlil decrees a flood to wipe out humanity entirely. The assembly agrees, but Enki, who created humanity and serves as their patron, refuses to abandon his creation. He cannot directly violate the assembly's decree, but he can work around it. He speaks to Atrahasis through a reed wall, ostensibly talking to the wall itself rather than the man behind it. He instructs Atrahasis to build a boat, seal it with bitumen, load it with animals and provisions, and survive the coming catastrophe. The flood comes. Waters rise. Humanity drowns. The text describes the gods themselves regretting their decision as they watch the destruction from heaven. The goddess Nintu weeps, lamenting, "How could I, in the assembly of the gods, order such destruction?" Even Enlil, who decreed the flood, is shaken by the totality of the annihilation. When the waters recede, Atrahasis makes offerings. The gods, who have been deprived of human worship and offerings during the flood, smell the sacrifice and gather around like flies. They are hungry. They need humanity, despite humanity's problems. Enlil is furious that someone survived. His decree was absolute extermination. But Enki defends his actions, and a compromise is reached. Humanity will be allowed to continue, but with limitations, shorter lifespans, increased infant mortality, infertile women. Population will be controlled naturally rather than through catastrophe. The Eridu Genesis version concludes with An and Enlil granting Ziusudra life like a god and settling him in Dilmun, the paradise land where he dwells eternally. These narratives are not primarily about divine anger or moral judgment. They're about population management, resource allocation, and the tension between divine convenience and human survival. But there's another dimension rarely emphasized in conventional interpretation: the flood as bloodline crisis. Consider what the texts actually say. Before the flood, 8 kings rule for a total of 241,200 years. These are not human lifespans. These rulers possess something that enables extended longevity. After the flood, kingship must be lowered from heaven again, as if it had been removed or lost. When post-flood kings appear, their reign lengths are dramatically shorter, but still superhuman. 1200 years, 900 years, 600 years. Then progressively decreasing, 400 years, 300 years, 150 years. Eventually reaching human ranges, 90 years, 40 years, 30 years. This pattern suggests genetic dilution. The pre-flood rulers possessed high concentration of divine ancestry, perhaps direct children of Anunnaki or early generation hybrids with minimal human admixture. The flood kills nearly everyone. Only a handful survive, Ziusudra or Atrahasis/Utnapishtim, depending on the version, his family, and possibly a few others who reach the boat. If the divine bloodline existed in concentrated form before the flood, and if only a few individuals carrying that bloodline survived, then post-flood humanity would show genetic bottleneck effects. The bloodline would continue, but in diluted form. Each generation would show further dilution unless carefully maintained through selective breeding, which is precisely what the royal genealogies and sacred marriage rituals attempt. This explains why Ziusudra is specifically granted eternal life. He already possessed extended longevity as a pre-flood king and priest. The gods restore or reinforce that trait, ensuring he retains the divine component despite the flood's interruption. He becomes the bridge, the preserved bloodline from which post-flood kingship descends. The king list supports this interpretation. After noting the flood, it states, after the flood had swept over and kingship descended from heaven once more, Kish became the seat of kingship. The first king of Kish, Gar-Ur, rules for 1,200 years, far beyond human norms, but far below pre-flood standards. He carries the bloodline, but in reduced form. Why does kingship need to descend from heaven again? If it's merely abstract political authority, it should simply continue with whoever survived. But if kingship requires specific biological credentials, if it functions through genetic heritage, then the flood would interrupt that lineage. The genes nearly die out. Only a few carriers remain. The Anunnaki must re-establish the bloodline, perhaps through renewed divine human interbreeding, to restore functional kingship. This is why the post-flood kings still claim divine parentage. They're not inventing new claims, they're documenting the renewed bloodline. The Anunnaki didn't abandon humanity after the flood. They restored the system, re-established the royal lineages, and continued the pattern of divine human unions that produced qualified rulers. But something had changed. The flood represented a rupture, a discontinuity. The pre-flood world, where gods and humans mingled more freely, where rulers lived for millennia, where the bloodline was concentrated and pure, that world was gone. The post-flood reality showed degradation, dilution, shorter lifespans. The divine component was fading across generations. Later Mesopotamian texts reflect this as nostalgic memory. The time before the flood was the Golden Age, when sages walked the earth teaching wisdom, when kings reigned for eons, when heaven and earth were closely connected. After the flood, that direct connection weakened. The gods became more distant, kings became more human. Eventually, the bloodline degraded to the point where legitimate divine kingship was no longer possible. The flood narratives in this reading document a genetic catastrophe as much as a mythological event. Whether the flood was historical, and there is geological evidence for massive flooding events in Mesopotamia's history, or whether it represents compressed memory of climate changes and societal collapse, the Mesopotamians understood it as the event that nearly ended the bloodline and permanently weakened humanity's connection to the divine. The texts are explicit. Before the flood, 8 kings with impossibly long reigns. After the flood, kingship must be re-established with diminished potency. The pattern of progressive reduction in royal longevity across post-flood dynasties follows precisely what we'd expect from genetic dilution after a population bottleneck. The Sumerians were documenting something. Whether they understood it in genetic terms or described it through their cultural framework of divine blood and sacred lineage, they recorded a transition from concentrated bloodline before the flood through near extinction at the flood to gradual dilution after the flood, until eventually the divine component faded entirely and kingship became purely human political authority. The flood was not merely a story about divine anger and a righteous survivor. It was the crisis point where the Anunnaki bloodline nearly ended, and its aftermath explains why later kings showed progressively weakening claims to divine ancestry. The bloodline continued, but it was never the same. The connection had been severed, then re-established, but always weaker, always diminishing, until finally the age of divine kingship ended and purely human rulers took the throne. Post-flood restoration, kingship descends again. The phrase appears immediately after the flood section in every version of the Sumerian king list. After the flood had swept over and kingship descended from heaven once more, Kish became the seat of kingship once more. Not kingship resumed or kingship continued, it descended from heaven again. The deliberate repetition of the pre-flood formula suggests a conscious parallel. What happened before the flood happens again after it. Kingship is not a continuous human institution that survived the catastrophe. It's a divine grant that must be renewed, lowered from heaven a second time, because the first establishment was interrupted. The first dynasty of Kish lists 23 kings. The text preserves varying reign lengths depending on which version of the king list is consulted, but the pattern is consistent. Reign lengths far exceed normal human lifespans, but fall dramatically short of pre-flood standards. Gar-ur, first king of Kish, rules for 1,100 years, according to some versions. Gula-Nidaba Anapad rules for 960 years. Zukakip rules for 900 years. These numbers are impossible for modern humans, but represent a 5 to 10-fold reduction from pre-flood norms, where single rulers reigned for 28,000 or 36,000 years. This is not random variation, it's systematic reduction following precise pattern. The texts show a bloodline that still functions, but with diminished potency. The divine component remains, but in reduced concentration.
The kings are still hybrids, still capable of extended longevity, but nowhere near pre-flood levels. As the king list progresses through subsequent dynasties, the pattern continues. Later kings of Kish show shorter reigns, 600 years, 420 years, 300 years. When kingship transfers to Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, the reign shortened further. Meshi-Angasha rules 324 years. Enmerkar rules 420 years. Lugalbanda rules 1,200 years. A temporary return to early longevity, possibly through renewed divine human interbreeding. Then Gilgamesh rules 126 years.
Gilgamesh is the pivotal figure. His reign length is exceptional for a human. 126 years places him far beyond normal lifespan, but it's human scale compared to earlier rulers. He is explicitly described as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. The mathematics of this proportion suggests his heritage. If one parent is fully divine and the other is half divine, the offspring would be 3/4 divine. If one parent is fully divine and the other is fully human, the offspring would be half divine. Gilgamesh's 2/3 proportion suggests one fully divine parent and one parent who is 1/3 divine, perhaps a second-generation hybrid. His mother Ninsun is consistently identified as goddess. His father Lugalbanda is described as a king and later deified. The genealogy shows active management of the bloodline, divine mother plus hybrid father, slugger, enhanced hybrid son. This is selective breeding to maintain divine ancestry concentration. After Gilgamesh, the dilution accelerates. Subsequent kings show progressively shorter reigns. By the time the king list reaches the first dynasty of Ur, Mesanapada, and his son Ar-Anapada, who ruled around 2600 BC, the reign lengths are 80 and 36 years respectively. These are long human lifespans, but no longer superhuman. The divine component has degraded to the point where it no longer grants exceptional longevity. By the early dynastic III period, approximately 2500 BR, the kings listed are verifiable historical figures whose reigns can be cross-checked with archaeological evidence and contemporary inscriptions. These rulers show normal human lifespans. The transition from mythological to historical is complete, but the genealogical claims don't stop. Even when kings no longer live for centuries, they still claim divine ancestry. The difference is qualitative. Earlier kings claimed divine parentage and demonstrated it through superhuman longevity. Later kings claimed divine parentage but showed no biological evidence beyond normal human capability. The bloodline had diluted to the point where its functional benefits were lost, but the genealogical traditions remained. This is why Shulgi of Ur, ruling around 2100 BC, needed to make such explicit claims to divine parentage. By his era, the functional bloodline was gone. Kings were biologically human. But the constitutional principle remained. Legitimate kingship requires divine ancestry. So Shulgi manufactured or emphasized his genealogical connection to Ninsun and Lugubanda, the last clearly superhuman figures in the tradition, to demonstrate his credentials. The post-flood restoration, then, was never complete. The Anunnaki re-established kingship, renewed the bloodline through divine human interbreeding, and created new hybrid rulers. But the genetic component degraded steadily across generations. Each dynasty showed shorter lifespans than the previous. Each generation possessed less divine heritage than the last. The bloodline was a resource being gradually depleted. Why didn't the Anunnaki simply create new hybrids to restore full potency? The texts suggest they withdrew, became less directly involved with humanity after the flood. The decision to send the flood created permanent rupture in divine-human relations. The gods regretted the near annihilation. They agreed to let humanity continue, but with limitations. Perhaps one of those limitations was reduced divine intervention, fewer direct interactions, fewer divine-human unions, less direct management of human affairs. This would explain the transition from the pre-flood era, when gods and humans apparently mingled freely, to the post-flood era, where divine contact becomes increasingly mediated through priests, temples and rituals rather than direct encounter. The kings continue to claim divine ancestry and perform rituals to maintain that connection, but the immediate presence of the gods recedes. The sacred marriage ritual becomes essential in this context. With the Anunnaki less directly present, humanity must maintain the bloodline through human mechanisms. The annual ritual where the king unites with Inanna's representative serves as the substitute for divine human interbreeding. It's humanity taking responsibility for preserving the bloodline after the gods stepped back from direct involvement. But it's a losing battle. Each generation dilutes further. The ritual maintains connection symbolically and possibly genetically if the priestesses represent preserved bloodlines, but it cannot restore what was lost at the flood. The trend is irreversible decline. By the end of the Ur III dynasty, the last to claim divine status for living kings, the bloodline has effectively ended as functional reality. Later Mesopotamian kings still perform the sacred marriage ritual, still claim divine favour, still position themselves as intermediaries between gods and humans, but they don't claim goddess mothers or superhuman lifespans. They're human rulers, governing by political authority rather than biological credentials. The king list documents this entire trajectory with bureaucratic precision. Impossible lifespans before the flood, superhuman but reduced lifespans immediately after, progressively shorter reigns across dynasties until eventually normal human ranges. It's a genetic genealogy showing dilution across time from an initial concentration that no longer exists. The post-flood restoration was real. Kingship was re-established, the bloodline was renewed, hybrid rulers governed again. But it was restoration to diminished state, not return to pre-flood purity. And that diminished state continued degrading until the age of divine kingship ended entirely. The texts document this with clarity. The pattern is systematic, not random. The reduction in longevity follows predictable trajectory. This is not mythology about symbolic legitimacy. This is genealogical record showing bloodline dilution across generations following a catastrophic bottleneck event. Whether the Sumerians understood this in biological terms or conceptualized it as divine essence fading from the mortal world, they were documenting something real to them, the progressive loss of the Anunnaki heritage that once qualified kings to rule as intermediaries between heaven and earth. The third dynasty, the last divine kings. The city of located in southern Mesopotamia near the ancient course of the Euphrates River, experienced its greatest prominence during what scholars term the Ur-3 period, approximately 2112-2004 BCE. This dynasty, founded by Ur-Nammu, expanded by his son Shulgi, and continued through 3 more generations, represents the final flowering of divine kingship in Mesopotamian tradition. Unlike earlier periods where divine kingship is claimed but difficult to verify historically, the Ur-3 dynasty is extensively documented. We have thousands of administrative tablets from this period recording temple offerings, government bureaucracy, military campaigns, construction projects, legal proceedings. We can verify that these kings existed, trace their policies, date their reigns with precision. This makes their claims to divinity particularly striking. These are not legendary figures in distant past. These are documented historical rulers governing a real empire, and they claim to be gods. Ur-Nammu, founder of the dynasty, presents himself in inscriptions as chosen by the gods Anu and Enlil to restore order after the Gutian period. He doesn't initially claim divine status for himself, but emphasizes his divine appointment and his role as restorer of temples and proper worship. His famous law code, one of the earliest legal collections in human history, begins by describing how the gods chose him to establish justice. But his son Shulgi escalates dramatically. As we've examined, Shulgi claims Ninsun and Lugalbanda as divine parents, positions himself as Gilgamesh's brother, and during his reign begins writing his name with the determinative sign for divinity. He is not merely claiming divine ancestry, he is claiming divine status for himself while living. His royal hymns describe him receiving worship, people swearing oaths by his name, temple offerings made to him directly. This was unprecedented in Mesopotamian tradition. Earlier kings were deified after death, transformed into protective spirits or minor deities. But Shulgi establishes his own cult during his lifetime. He appears in offering lists alongside Nana, the moon god of Uwa, Ningal Ninsun, and Lugalbanda. He receives regular offerings of bread, beer, and animal sacrifices. He is worshipped. Why would his subjects accept this? If a modern political leader declared himself divine and demanded worship, he'd be dismissed as megalomaniacal. Yet Shulgi's divine cult operated for decades and continued after his death. Temple bureaucracies throughout his empire incorporated offerings to divine Shulgi into their regular schedules. Priests swore their professional oaths by his name. Legal documents invoked his divinity. This makes sense only if the cultural framework genuinely accepted that exceptional individuals could possess divine nature. If the bloodline concept was real to them, if they believed that certain genealogical lines carried divine essence, then a king who documented his descent from divine ancestors and demonstrated exceptional capability could credibly claim divine status. Shulgi ruled for approximately 48 years, a long but not superhuman lifespan. His father Ur-Nammu had ruled 18 years before dying in battle. Shulgi's successors, Amarsin, Shusin and Ibisin, ruled 9, 9 and 24 years respectively before the dynasty collapsed under pressure from Elamite invasions and internal instability. These are normal human lifespans. The Ur-3 kings showed no biological evidence of superhuman longevity as earlier legendary rulers had, yet they maintained the divine kingship claim. They performed the sacred marriage ritual annually. They built temples to their divine ancestors. They positioned themselves in the genealogical line descending from the Anunnaki through Ninsun and Lugalbanda. They were the last dynasty to confidently assert that the king was not merely appointed by gods, but was himself divine. After Earth III collapsed around 2004 BCE, the pattern changes. Subsequent dynasties in Isin, Larsa, and eventually Babylon still claim divine favour and royal legitimacy through religious means, but they don't claim living divine status. They don't establish temple cults to themselves. They don't write hymns describing their divine nature. The confident assertion, "I am born of the goddess," disappears from royal rhetoric. What happened? Several possibilities emerged. First, the political instability and military defeats that ended Year 3 may have discredited the divine kingship model. If kings are truly divine, why did they fail? Why did Year fall? The collapse may have shattered the believability of divine ruler claims. Second, the bloodline may have literally ended. If divine kingship required specific genetic heritage, and if the Year 3 dynasty represented the last family maintaining concentrated bloodline, then their extinction would mean no one remained with legitimate credentials. Later rulers might claim kingship through military power or political manoeuvring, but they couldn't claim the biological foundation that earlier dynasties possessed. Third, the cultural framework may have shifted. As Mesopotamian society became more complex, more urbanized, more dependent on bureaucratic administration rather than direct royal authority, the functional role of the king changed. Divine intermediary became less necessary as temple priesthoods grew more powerful and autonomous. The king became administrator rather than cosmic conduit. Archaeological evidence suggests all three factors operated simultaneously. The Year 3 collapse was catastrophic, cities burned, populations displaced, administrative systems destroyed. The dynasty's royal line apparently died out. Later kings don't claim descent from Ur-3 rulers the way Shulgi claimed descent from Gilgamesh. And the subsequent Isin-Larsa period shows fragmented political authority with multiple competing dynasties rather than unified divine kingship. But the memory remained. Later Babylonian texts from the early 2nd millennium BCA describe Shulgi as the ideal king, the model of royal perfection. His hymns were copied in scribal schools as literary classics. His administrative innovations were credited with creating the bureaucratic systems later kingdoms inherited. He was remembered as something exceptional, something lost. The sacred marriage ritual continued being performed for another 1,000 years, but with transformed meaning. In the Old Babylonian period, the ritual appears more explicitly symbolic, more theatrical, less clearly believed as literal divine human union. The king still played the role of divine consort, the priestess still represented Inanna, but the institutional infrastructure surrounding it suggests performance rather than constitutional necessity. Later Babylonian and Assyrian kings still claimed divine appointment and divine favour. They still positioned themselves as chosen by the great gods, Marduk in Babylon, Ashur in Assyria. But they didn't claim divine mothers or divine nature. They were human servants of the gods, not hybrid beings bridging divine and mortal realms. The Ur-3 dynasty stands as the last clear expression of the divine kingship model that began when, according to the Sumerian king list, kingship descended from heaven before the flood. For 3,000 years, from the earliest written records through Shulgi's reign, Mesopotamian civilization operated on the principle that legitimate rulers descended from divine bloodlines established by the Anunnaki. Kings claimed goddess mothers, superhuman ancestry, biological credentials that qualified them for cosmic intermediary roles. After Ur-3, that model faded. Kingship became political office rather than cosmic function. Rulers were human administrators managing complex societies, not hybrid beings channeling divine authority. The bloodline, if it ever existed functionally, had degraded beyond recovery. The age of divine kings ended. The texts document this transition with clarity. The earthly kings maintained temple cults, performed sacred marriage rituals, claimed divine ancestry, and received worship. Immediately after Year 3, these practices either ended or transformed into symbolic performance. The confidence disappeared. The biological claims vanished. Human kingship replaced divine kingship. Whether this represents literal loss of a genetic bloodline, cultural shift away from ancient beliefs, or political changes making divine kingship untenable, the Sumerians and their successors documented it as the end of an era. The direct connection between heaven and earth, maintained through divine-human hybrid rulers, was severed. The bloodline that ruled early civilization no longer existed in functional form, and humanity entered an age where gods and mortals no longer mingled, where kings were human, and where the ancient connection to the Anunnaki remained only as cultural memory recorded in texts increasingly distant from living reality. What the mainstream cannot explain. The conventional academic interpretation of Sumerian kingship treats them as legitimation ideology, mythological narratives constructed to justify political power. Kings claimed divine descent not because they actually possessed it, but because such claims provided religious sanction for their rule. The genealogies are symbolic, expressing the idea that kingship originates with divine will rather than documenting biological reality. The pre-flood rulers, with impossibly long reigns, are legendary figures, and the transition to historical periods represents the shift from myth to memory to documented history. This interpretation is not unreasonable. It fits comfortably within materialist historical frameworks that treat religious claims as epiphenomena of political structures. It avoids uncomfortable implications of taking ancient texts literally. It aligns with our modern understanding that humans do not live for thousands of years, and that gods, if they exist at all, do not physically reproduce with humans. But this interpretation struggles to account for specific textual patterns the sources themselves present. First, the Sumerian king list's format never changes from pre-flood to post-flood to historical periods. It maintains the same bureaucratic tone, the same structural elements, the same administrative style throughout. It lists cities, names rulers, records reign lengths, and notes when kingship transferred from one city to another. The text treats Elulim of Eridu re-flood, ruling 28,800 years, with the same documentary style as Emebrajesi of Kish historical period, ruling 900 years, verified through contemporary inscriptions. If the document is mixing myth and history, the scribes give no indication they recognize a distinction. The format implies they believed they were recording historical fact throughout. Second, the Sumerian texts are remarkably consistent across multiple independent sources. The king list exists in numerous versions discovered at different sites from different periods, and despite variations in specific details, the overall pattern remains constant in possibly long pre-flood reigns, flood event, re-establishment of kingship with reduced lifespans, progressive, shortening across dynasties. This consistency suggests a stable tradition, not ad hoc myth-making. Similarly, genealogical claims appear across multiple text types. Gilgamesh's divine parentage is mentioned in king lists, royal hymns, epic narratives, incantations, and historical inscriptions. Shulgi's claim to descend from Ninsun and Lugalbanda appears in multiple hymns, temple dedications, offering lists, and administrative documents. These aren't isolated poetic flourishes, they're systematic assertions embedded in diverse institutional contexts. Third, the resource commitment to maintaining divine ancestor cults is difficult to explain as pure propaganda. Shulgi dedicated enormous resources, land grants, temple constructions, permanent priesthoods, daily offerings to the cult of Ninsun and Lugalbanda. These were not symbolic gestures. Temple archives document decades of sustained expenditure. Priests were employed full-time to maintain these cults. Agricultural estates generated revenue assigned specifically to divine ancestor worship. If this is merely propaganda, it's extraordinarily expensive propaganda, and propaganda works by persuading audiences. But internal administrative documents, temple offering lists, priestly schedules, budgetary records continue referencing divine ancestor cults long after the kings who established them die. These aren't public-facing documents intended to impress subjects. They're internal institutional records. The cult maintenance continued because the institutions believed it served necessary function, not because it impressed anyone. Fourth, the pattern of decreasing reign lengths follows too precise a trajectory to be random mythological elaboration. Pre-flood kings, 21,000, 43,200 years. Immediate post-flood kings, 900,000, 1,200 years. Second generation post-flood, 600, 900 years. Third generation, 300, 600 years. Continuing downward until reaching normal human ranges by approximately 2600 BCE. This isn't random legendary inflation, it's systematic reduction following predictable curve. If ancient scribes were inventing prestigious ancestors and simply assigning them impressive reign lengths, we'd expect more variation, more obvious symbolic numbers, Herfic thousands, divine numbers like 60 or 360, or consistent legendary inflation. Instead, we see specific reductions following pattern that looks like biological degradation across generations. Fifth, the sacred marriage rituals, mandatory nature, and institutional infrastructure exceeds what symbolic fertility magic requires. The ritual was performed annually, required enormous preparation, consumed significant resources, involved the highest religious and political authorities, and was considered essential to the kingdom's survival. A king who failed to perform it was not merely being impious, he was constitutionally unqualified to continue ruling. This makes sense if the ritual served a functional purpose beyond symbolism. Sixth, the specificity of divine genealogies is unusual for pure mythology. Mythological systems typically feature fluid, adaptable divine families where relationships shift between variants and regional traditions. But Sumerian divine genealogies show remarkable consistency. Ninsun is always Gilgamesh's mother, Lugalbanda is always his father, Enlil always grants kingship, and always presides over the assembly. These relationships are stable across centuries and sources. This suggests they're preserving specific information rather than generating flexible mythology. Seventh, the Mesopotamians themselves never treat these accounts as metaphorical. They don't have a textual genre distinction between historical chronicles and mythological narratives the way modern literature does. The king lists, royal hymns, creation epics, and administrative documents all use similar language and occupy similar positions in their textual hierarchy. The culture doesn't give us evidence that they understood some texts as literal and others as symbolic. They appear to have treated all of it as documented reality. The mainstream interpretation must explain away these patterns by arguing that ancient peoples simply didn't think critically about their religious traditions, that they accepted mutually contradictory beliefs without concern, that expensive institutional infrastructure was maintained for purely symbolic reasons, and that precise numerical patterns in legendary materials are coincidental. Each individual argument is plausible, but together they require us to dismiss a great deal of specific textual evidence as meaningless noise. An alternative framework suggests itself. The Sumerians were documenting something real to them, something they understood as biological or genetic reality, which they describe through their cultural vocabulary of divine bloodlines and cosmic order. Whether their understanding was accurate, whether they were describing literal genetic reality, misinterpreting observed phenomena, or preserving compressed cultural memory of something we lack framework to understand, they were systematically recording what they believed to be historical fact. The bloodline wasn't metaphor to them, it was constitutional law. Kingship required specific ancestry from specific divine figures. That ancestry was tracked through genealogies, maintained through ritual, and documented with the same administrative precision applied to grain stores and tax revenue. When the bloodline degraded across generations, they documented that too, recording the progressive loss of superhuman longevity and eventual end of divine kingship. Three interpretive frameworks compete. First, pure mythology. The entire system is religious fantasy invented to legitimize political power, and all patterns are coincidental or meaningless. Second, encoded truth. The texts preserve actual historical information, but described through cultural frameworks we must decode, possibly representing rule by a genetically distinct elite population, possibly preserving compressed memory of civilization's origins in ways we don't fully understand. Third, literal truth. The texts mean what they say. Beings called Anunnaki established bloodlines through interbreeding with humanity, and these bloodlines ruled for millennia before degrading. The first framework is conventional but struggles with textual specificity. The third framework is unconventional but aligns with what texts actually say. The second framework attempts middle ground, acknowledging the text documents something real while remaining agnostic about ultimate interpretation. What cannot be dismissed is that the Sumerians systematically recorded a consistent account across centuries. Kingship descended from heaven, operated through specific bloodlines, descended from beings called Anunnaki, granted exceptional capabilities, including extended lifespan, degraded across generations following the flood catastrophe, and eventually ended when the bloodline could no longer be functionally maintained. They recorded this with bureaucratic precision. They committed enormous resources to preserving it institutionally. They structured their entire civilization around it for 3,000 years. They never indicate they understood it as metaphor. Whether we interpret this as literal genetic reality, cultural memory of something we don't understand, or elaborate mythological system, we cannot ignore what the texts actually say and how seriously the culture took those claims. The mainstream interpretation explains away too much evidence while adding assumptions the texts themselves don't support. The Sumerian king list, the royal genealogies, the sacred marriage rituals, the divine ancestor cults, the progression of reign lengths, and the institutional infrastructure all point in the same direction. The Anunnaki bloodline was understood as real, functional, and necessary for legitimate kingship. And whether that understanding reflected literal biology or something else, it shaped the foundation of civilization for 3 millennia until the bloodline finally ended and human kingship began. The bloodline and the questions that remain. The vault beneath Oxford remains unchanged. The Weld Blundell prism sits in its climate-controlled environment, 8 inches of clay bearing the weight of questions that span 4 millennia. The wedge-shaped impressions pressed into its surface by an ancient scribe document, a claim that our current paradigm struggles to accommodate. Kingship descended from heaven, operated through bloodlines connecting mortal rulers to beings called Anunnaki, and governed early civilization through. Genealogies carefully preserved across generations. The texts are clear. 8 pre-flood rulers with impossibly long reigns. A catastrophic flood that nearly extinguished humanity and interrupted the bloodline. Re-establishment of kingship with reduced potency. Progressive dilution across post-flood dynasties. Specific genealogical claims, divine mothers bearing kings, sacred marriage rituals maintaining the connection, institutional infrastructure supporting divine ancestor cults. And finally, after 3,000 years of documented divine kingship, the pattern ends. Human rulers replace hybrid intermediaries. The bloodline, if it ever existed functionally, degrades beyond recovery. We've examined the evidence across 14 dimensions, the archaeological context of Sumerian civilization, the documentary style of the king list, the specificity of divine genealogies, the Anunnaki as documented assembly of beings with names, functions, and institutional presence, the template of Adapa showing how divine human hybrids were understood to function, the flood as bloodline crisis, the sacred marriage ritual as maintenance mechanism, the institutional resources committed to divine ancestor cults, the final expression of divine kingship in the Ur III dynasty, and the textual problems that conventional interpretation struggles to explain. What remains is the question, what were the Sumerians actually recording? 3 interpretative frameworks have been proposed, but the evidence does not force a choice. The text can be read as pure mythology, religious narratives, constructed to legitimize political power, with all specificity and consistency merely coincidental elaboration. They can be read as encoded reality, preserving actual historical information through cultural frameworks we must learn to decode, possibly documenting rule by genetically distinct populations, or preserving compressed civilizational memory in forms we don't fully understand. Or they can be read literally, beings called Anunnaki established bloodlines through biological interbreeding with humanity. These bloodlines granted exceptional capabilities, including extended longevity, and the system functioned until the bloodline degraded beyond recovery. Each framework has problems. Pure mythology must explain away the textual consistency, the institutional infrastructure, the precise numerical patterns, and the bureaucratic documentation style. Encoded reality must specify what historical truth the text preserve and why it would be described through genetic/bloodline vocabulary. Literal interpretation must explain mechanisms that seem biologically impossible by modern understanding and integrate claims that appear to violate known physical laws. But the uncertainty about ultimate interpretation doesn't erase what the texts demonstrably show. The Sumerians systematically recorded for 3 millennia that their rulers descended from divine beings through documented bloodlines, that this heritage was functional rather than merely symbolic, and that it eventually degraded and ended. They believed this. They structured their civilization around it. They committed resources to maintaining it. They never indicate they understood it as metaphor. Whether they were accurately documenting biological reality, preserving compressed cultural memory of something we lack framework to understand, or elaborating sophisticated religious mythology, they were recording something real to them. The questions that remain are not about what the texts say. That's documented. The questions are about what the texts mean. If kingship truly descended from heaven, what physical or institutional process does that phrase describe? If the Anunnaki established bloodlines, who or what were the Anunnaki in historical reality? If divine human hybrids ruled early civilization, what genetic or biological reality might that represent? If the flood interrupted the bloodline, what historical catastrophe does that preserve? If sacred marriage rituals maintained the connection, what actual function did those rituals serve? If the bloodline eventually degraded and ended, what was lost when divine kingship transitioned to human political authority? These questions cannot be answered definitively from the available evidence. The texts provide data points, but not complete explanation. The institutional infrastructure demonstrates seriousness of belief, but not ultimate truth of that belief. The consistency across sources shows stable tradition, but not necessarily accurate tradition. We have documentation of what the Sumerians recorded and how seriously they took it. We don't have certain knowledge of what historical reality produced those records. What we can say is that dismissing it as pure mythology ignores too much evidence. The texts are too specific, too consistent, too systematically documented, supported by too much institutional infrastructure to be casually invented religious fantasy. Something real, whether literal biology, preserved cultural memory, genetic elite class, or phenomenon we lack framework to comprehend, produced this pervasive, persistent, precisely documented belief system that structured the foundation of civilization. The Anunnaki bloodline was real to the Sumerians. Whether it was real in the sense we understand reality remains unresolved, but that uncertainty doesn't diminish the evidence that they documented it, believed it, structured their society around it, and maintained it for 3,000 years until it ended. Perhaps the question is not whether the bloodline was real, but whether we possess the paradigm to understand what reality they were documenting. Modern materialist frameworks assume certain impossibilities. Humans do not live for millennia. Divine beings do not physically reproduce with humans. Biological heritage does not grant cosmic intermediary capabilities. But what if those assumptions blind us to patterns in the evidence? What if the Sumerians were describing accurately something we simply lack the conceptual tools to comprehend? Or perhaps they were elaborating mythology, but mythology so compelling and functionally useful that it organised civilization structure for 3 millennia despite being false. That too would tell us something profound about human nature, about the power of narrative, about civilization's foundations. The prism beneath Oxford offers no final answers. It simply preserves the questions in wedge-shaped script, waiting patiently for minds capable of interpreting them. The weight of those questions presses against current understanding, challenging paradigms, resisting easy dismissal, demanding that we take seriously what ancient peoples systematically documented even when it seems impossible. What were they recording? The question remains open. The evidence remains accessible. The text continues speaking across 4 millennia, preserving accounts of kingship that descended from heaven, bloodlines connecting rulers to beings called Anunnaki, and a system that governed early civilization through carefully maintained genealogies until it finally ended and humanity entered. An age where kings were merely human, and the gods, if they ever walked among cities, had permanently withdrawn. The mystery honours those who documented it. Their precision deserves our attention. Their institutions demonstrate their seriousness. Their consistency across centuries proves this wasn't casual invention. They were recording something. What that something was, whether literal biology, encoded history, or sophisticated mythology, remains for each of us to contemplate as we examine the evidence they left behind. If you followed this investigation from the Oxford Vault to the final dynasties, from impossible pre-flood reigns to documented historical rulers, from divine mothers to sacred marriage rituals, from Anunnaki assembly to gradual bloodline degradation, then you've encountered the same evidence. The scholars continue debating. You've seen what the texts actually say versus how they're conventionally interpreted. You've traced the pattern of claims, institutions, and systematic documentation that span 3 millennia of civilization. The conclusion is yours to read. The texts provide evidence. The institutions demonstrate belief. The consistency shows stable tradition. But the ultimate meaning, what historical or biological or cultural reality produced this pervasive documentation of divine bloodlines ruling early civilization, remains open to interpretation. Perhaps that openness is appropriate. The Sumerians recorded questions as much as answers. They documented the bloodline's existence and its end without fully explaining either. They preserved the tradition without resolving the mystery. In this, we follow their example, examining evidence carefully, respecting what texts actually say, acknowledging institutional seriousness, but ultimately allowing uncertainty to remain where certainty is not justified. The bloodline that ruled early civilization is documented. Whether it existed as they believed remains civilization's oldest unanswered question. And perhaps the truest way to honour their documentation is not to force premature conclusions, but to hold the question carefully, examining evidence with precision and humility, neither dismissing nor credulously accepting, but remaining open to possibilities that our current frameworks may not yet accommodate. Rest now with that uncertainty. The texts will still be there tomorrow. The questions will persist. And somewhere beneath Oxford, the prism waits in its vault, bearing silent witness to the impossible claims carved into its surface 4,000 years ago by scribes who believed they were documenting truth.